I stood in my mother's dining room and told my entire family that I had lost everything. My mother smiled. My sister raised her glass. Nobody in that room knew they had just walked into a trap I had been building for 11 months. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch people celebrate what they thought was your downfall. My name is Vanessa Whitfield, and I am 36 years old. For 12 years, I have run a private investment consultancy that specializes in distressed asset acquisition, which is a complicated way of saying that I find companies and properties that are dying and I either save them or I take them apart for parts. I am good at my job. I am, according to 3 separate industry publications, one of the most quietly effective operators in my particular corner of finance. Quietly is the important word there. I have never wanted the spotlight. I have never wanted magazine covers or galas with my name on the step and repeat banner. I wanted to build something real, something that stood on its own math, and I wanted my family to be proud of me for the substance of what I built rather than the size of the number attached to it. That was, in retrospect, an extremely naive thing to want from my family. My parents, Gerald and Diane Whitfield, raised 2 daughters in a house that ran on comparison the way other houses run on electricity. Every accomplishment was measured against my younger sister Kendall's accomplishments, and for reasons I never fully understood, Kendall always won, regardless of what either of us had actually done. When Kendall got a B+ and I got an A, my mother would say that Kendall's B+ was in a harder class. When I got into a better college than Kendall, my father would point out that Kendall's school had a better football team, as though that settled anything. When I built my consultancy from nothing, working 18-hour days out of a studio apartment with a folding table for a desk, and Kendall married a man named Bradley Sorensen, who inherited a mid-sized regional furniture chain from his father, my mother began introducing Kendall at every family gathering as my daughter who married so well, and introducing me as my other daughter, the one who works too much. I want to be clear that I do not resent my sister for any of this. Kendall did not build the family dynamic. My parents built it, brick by brick, over 3.5 decades, and Kendall simply grew up inside a house where she had learned, correctly, that being favored meant never having to try particularly hard. What I resent, if I am being honest with myself in this quiet moment before I tell you what happened, is the way my parents used my success as a weapon against me instead of a source of pride. They never wanted to hear about my work. They wanted to hear about my failures, because my failures made the family narrative make sense. In the story my parents told themselves, Kendall was the golden child who did everything right, and I was the stubborn, difficult daughter who chose an unstable, uncertain path instead of settling down like a normal woman was supposed to. My financial success did not fit that story, so for years, my parents simply pretended it did not exist. They never asked about my clients. They never asked about my deals. They asked at every single dinner whether I had met anyone yet, as though the entire architecture of my professional life was a footnote to the far more important question of my marital status. 18 months ago, everything came to a head at my father's 65th birthday dinner. I had flown back from a closing in Chicago that afternoon, exhausted, still wearing the blazer I had worn into a boardroom 12 hours earlier, because I did not have time to change before my flight. I walked into my parents' house carrying a gift, a first edition book my father had mentioned wanting 3 years earlier that I had spent months tracking down through a rare book dealer in London. I was tired in the particular way that only comes from closing a 9-figure deal and then getting on a plane, but I was happy. I was proud of the gift. I thought, for one foolish moment, that this might be the dinner where something shifted. My mother took one look at me and said, in front of the entire extended family, "Vanessa, you look absolutely exhausted. This is exactly why nobody wants to marry you. You come home looking like you slept in an airport." The table laughed. Not cruelly exactly. Comfortably. The kind of laughter that comes from people repeating a joke they have made 100 times before, a joke so worn smooth by repetition that nobody in the room even registers it as an insult anymore. My father chuckled into his wine glass. My Aunt Patricia shook her head fondly, as though my exhaustion after closing a deal that would eventually be written up in 3 trade publications was a personality flaw rather than a professional accomplishment. Kendall, sitting beside her husband Bradley, smiled the particular smile she reserved for these moments, the smile of someone who has never once had to defend the shape of her own life. I did not say anything that night. I gave my father the book. He said thank you, set it aside without opening it, and spent the rest of dinner asking Bradley detailed questions about a furniture showroom renovation in a way he had never once asked me about a single deal I had closed in 12 years of building a business from nothing. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for 40 minutes before I went inside. I was not crying. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there is a version of this story where I sob quietly and feel sorry for myself, and that is not what happened. What happened is that I sat in my car and I felt something cold and clear settle into place in my chest, the way a lock settles into place when the tumblers finally line up. I thought about every dinner, every birthday, every holiday where my accomplishments were treated as a slightly embarrassing hobby while Kendall's inherited comfort was treated as a triumph of character. I thought about the fact that my family did not actually want to know me. They wanted a version of me that fit the story they had already written, and when the real me did not fit, they simply edited around it, the same way you might crop an inconvenient detail out of a photograph. I decided, sitting in that driveway, that I was done trying to earn my way into a story that had already been written without me. I was not going to keep showing up with rare books and exhausted eyes, hoping that eventually the volume of my accomplishments would drown out my mother's narrative. Instead, I was going to give them exactly what they seemed to want. I was going to become, in their eyes, a failure, and then I was going to watch, very carefully, exactly what they did with that failure. Because I had a suspicion, cold and clear as that lock clicking into place, that the way my family treated me when they believed I had nothing left would tell me more true things about who they actually were than 18 years of holiday dinners ever had. What I did not fully understand yet, sitting in that driveway, was how far that suspicion would end up taking me, or how much of my family's actual financial architecture I would end up controlling before this was over. Let me back up and tell you what my family did not know about me, because it matters enormously to everything that happens next. My consultancy, Whitfield Strategic Partners, does not operate the way most boutique investment firms operate. I do not simply advise clients on distressed assets. Over the past 6 years, I have quietly built a portfolio of my own holdings, funded entirely by my own capital, structured through a private holding company that carries a name generic enough that nobody has ever connected it to me. I own commercial real estate in 3 states. I hold a significant minority position in a regional bank. I own, through 2 layers of holding structure, the mortgage on my parents' house, which they refinanced 4 years ago through a regional lender that later sold the loan into a larger portfolio, a portfolio that my holding company quietly purchased 18 months before that birthday dinner. For reasons that had nothing to do with my family, and everything to do with a distressed debt opportunity that happened to have excellent underlying collateral. I also own, through the same holding structure, roughly 40% of the commercial leases attached to the Sorensen Home Furnishings retail footprint, purchased not because I had any interest in furniture, but because the underlying real estate in 3 of Bradley Sorensen's showroom locations was extraordinarily undervalued relative to the surrounding commercial corridor, and because his father, before his death, had structured the original leases in a way that gave enormous leverage to whoever eventually held them. In other words, without my family knowing it, without Bradley knowing it, without anyone in that dining room knowing it, I already held a quiet, structural position over a significant portion of my family's financial life. I had built this over years, methodically, the same way I built everything, because it made sound investment sense independent of any personal motive. But sitting in that driveway after my father's birthday, I understood for the first time that I also held something else. I held the ability to watch my family's true character reveal itself, and then, if I chose to, I held the ability to do something about what I saw. So I built a plan. The plan required patience, which is the one resource I have always had more of than anyone gives me credit for. It required me to spend 11 months constructing a fiction, so convincing that even my closest colleagues believed it, while quietly protecting and growing the real architecture underneath. And it required me to walk into my mother's dining room on a Sunday afternoon in March and tell my family that I had lost everything. Here is how I built the fiction. 6 months before that Sunday, I began restructuring my public-facing presence. I let it be known, through carefully placed comments to the handful of people in my extended circle who I knew would repeat information to my mother, that Whitfield Strategic Partners had taken a significant position in a commercial real estate fund tied to a mixed-use development outside Charlotte, a development that, in the fiction I was constructing, had run into catastrophic zoning and financing problems. I created a paper trail. I had my actual attorney, who has represented me for 9 years and who I trust completely, draft documents for a shell scenario, a fictional restructuring, fictional creditor negotiations, fictional write-downs, all of it built on top of my real financial position but never actually touching it. My true holdings remained untouched, growing quietly in the background, insulated behind 3 layers of legal structure that nobody outside my inner circle had any visibility into. What I built instead was a convincing, detailed, financially literate-sounding story of collapse, the kind of story that would hold up if anyone in my family bothered to ask a single specific question. Nobody ever asked a single specific question. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. My family, over the following months, heard rumors that I was struggling. They saw me show up to 2 family events looking tired and distracted, wearing clothes slightly less polished than usual, driving a leased sedan instead of the car I actually owned outright. And not one single person, not my mother, not my father, not my sister, ever once asked me directly and with genuine concern what was actually happening or whether I needed help. They simply absorbed the story, because the story fit. A daughter who chased an unstable career finally hit the wall everyone had always predicted she would hit. It was, for my family, almost a relief. It confirmed everything they had always believed about the shape of my life. The final piece of the fiction came together on a Sunday in early March, at what was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner at my parents' house to celebrate Kendall and Bradley's 10th wedding anniversary. I arrived slightly late, which I had planned. I wore a plain gray sweater instead of anything from my actual wardrobe. I did not wear the watch I usually wear, a piece my grandmother left me that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with memory, because I did not want anything on my body that afternoon to read as anything other than exactly what I wanted them to see, a woman whose life had quietly come apart. Dinner proceeded normally for the first 30 minutes. My mother toasted Kendall and Bradley. My father told a long story about the early days of the furniture business that Bradley's father had built. A story I had heard perhaps a dozen times before, always told with more warmth than any story my father had ever told about my own career. And then, over dessert, my mother turned to me with the particular expression she gets when she is about to ask a question she already believes she knows the answer to, and she said, "Vanessa, you've been so quiet lately. Is everything all right with the business?" I set down my fork. I let a silence sit in the room for a moment longer than was comfortable, because I have learned, across 12 years of negotiating deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that silence is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone willing to use it. And then I told them. I told them that the Charlotte development had collapsed. I told them that a major creditor had called a loan I could not cover on the timeline demanded. I told them that I had spent the past several months in restructuring negotiations that had ultimately failed, that I had been forced to liquidate the majority of my personal holdings to cover the shortfall, that I had let go of most of my staff, and that I was, as of that week, essentially starting over from close to zero. I told them I had sold my car. I told them I had broken the lease on my downtown office and was working out of a small rented space I could barely afford. I told them, my voice carefully calibrated to sound exhausted rather than dramatic, that I had lost, by my own estimate, nearly everything I had spent 12 years building. I want to describe to you in careful detail exactly what happened in that dining room next, because it is the entire reason this story exists. My mother's first reaction was not concern. It was not even surprise. It was something closer to satisfaction, a settling, the particular expression of a person whose worldview has just been confirmed rather than challenged. She reached over and patted my hand and said, "Well, Vanessa, maybe now you'll understand why we always encouraged you to find something more stable. You can't build a whole life on risk." My father did not say anything at all for a long moment. Then he said, "How much did you actually lose?" "Approximately. Not are you okay? Not what do you need? How much did you lose?" The question of a man immediately calculating what this meant for the family's social standing rather than what it meant for his daughter's well-being. But it was Kendall who said the thing that told me, with total and final clarity, exactly what I needed to know. Kendall, sitting across the table in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as barely contained delight, and she said, "Oh my God, Vanessa. I mean, I'm so sorry, but honestly, this kind of makes me feel so much better about everything. I always felt like Mom compared us so much, and now I guess we know how that actually turned out." The table did not go silent in horror. The table did not defend me. My Aunt Patricia actually laughed, a short, surprised laugh she tried to cover with her napkin. Bradley, to his credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, though he said nothing. And my mother who had spent 36 years measuring my worth against my sister's, looked almost relieved, as though a tension she had been carrying for years had finally, mercifully released. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation to a party. The invitation came from Kendall, sent through a group text to the extended family, announcing a celebration at her and Bradley's house for what the text described as closing out an incredible year for Sorensen Home Furnishings and an amazing decade of marriage. I was included on the text, technically, the way you include someone out of obligation rather than genuine desire for their presence. When I called Kendall to ask about the party, she told me, with a lightness that told me she had not thought for even 1 second about how this would sound to a sister she believed had just lost everything, that they were planning to unveil a major expansion, 3 new showroom locations, a significant capital raise from outside investors. The kind of announcement that would put Sorensen Home Furnishings on a genuinely different scale than the comfortable regional business Bradley's father had built. "It's just going to be such a celebration," Kendall said. "I know things are hard for you right now, but I really hope you can come. It would mean so much to Mom." I told her I would be there. Before I go further, I want to take you back further than that driveway, because I do not think you can understand why I was capable of building an 11-month fiction without understanding the 20 years that came before it. I was 8 years old the first time I understood, with the specific clarity children sometimes have about things adults spend their whole lives failing to name, that my mother had already decided who each of her daughters was going to be. Kendall was 5. We were at my grandmother's house for Easter, and there was a hunt in the backyard, colored eggs hidden among the azaleas. The kind of ordinary childhood ritual that should not have meant anything at all. I found 11 eggs. Kendall found 4. When we brought our baskets inside, my mother knelt down in front of Kendall, admired her 4 eggs one at a time, told her how clever she was, how observant, how proud she should be. Then she looked at my basket, glanced at it for perhaps 2 seconds, and said, "Well, of course you found more, Vanessa, you're older." It was true. I was older. But it was also the first time I understood that in my mother's accounting, my accomplishments would always be explained away by circumstance, while Kendall's would always be evidence of character. This pattern did not soften as we got older. It hardened. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to stop bringing home report cards unless someone asked, because a string of A's earned a distracted nod and a reminder to help Kendall with her math homework, while a single B on Kendall's report card earned a full family conversation about resilience and effort and how proud we all were of how hard she had worked. I do not say this to suggest that Kendall was undeserving of encouragement. Every child deserves encouragement. What I am describing is not encouragement. It is a closed system, a household economy in which praise flowed toward one daughter by default and had to be earned, disproportionately and repeatedly, by the other. I went to college on a partial academic scholarship, supplementing the rest with 2 jobs and a series of loans I did not finish paying off until I was 29. Kendall's tuition was paid in full by our parents, without discussion, without question, the assumption baked so deeply into the family's operating logic that nobody, including me, ever thought to raise it as unfair at the time. It was simply how things were. I did not resent Kendall for this as a teenager, and I want to be honest that I do not fully resent her for it now. She did not build the system. She was simply born into a position within it that asked less of her and gave her more, and she took the shape of the space she was given, the way anyone would. What I built in the years after college, I built almost entirely without my family's financial help and largely without their attention. I worked as an analyst at a mid-sized investment firm for 4 years, learning the actual mechanics of distressed asset valuation from a mentor named Harold Ackerman, a gruff, exacting man in his 60s who was, in many ways, the first adult in my life who evaluated me purely on the quality of my work rather than on some inherited narrative about who I was supposed to be. Harold used to say that the market does not care about your family story. The market only cares whether you are right about the numbers. I clung to that sentence the way some people cling to scripture. It was the first framework I had ever been given in which my worth was determined entirely by something I could control. I left Harold's firm at 29 to start Whitfield Strategic Partners, working out of that studio apartment I mentioned, the folding table serving as my desk for the better part of 18 months. I remember calling my mother during that period to tell her about my first significant deal, a distressed strip mall in a secondary market that I had restructured and sold for a profit that, at the time, felt like the single greatest professional achievement of my life. My mother listened for perhaps 90 seconds before asking whether I had met anyone interesting lately, whether I was taking care of myself, whether I thought I might slow down eventually and find something with better hours. I did not call her with news like that again for almost 3 years. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that the 18 months I spent constructing my fictional collapse were not an isolated act of strategic cruelty born from a single bad birthday dinner. They were the final chapter of a pattern I had been quietly documenting, in one form or another, for nearly 3 decades. The birthday dinner was simply the moment the pattern finally became undeniable, even to me. The moment I stopped explaining it away as bad luck or bad timing or my own oversensitivity and started treating it as data. I want to pause the story here, before I tell you what happened at that party, and explain something about the actual financial mechanics underneath everything you are about to hear, because without understanding this, the rest of the story will not make sense. Bradley Sorensen's expansion plan, the one being celebrated at that party, required significant new capital. Sorensen Home Furnishings, despite its comfortable regional reputation, was carrying more debt than most people in my family understood or cared to understand. Bradley's father had financed the original showroom network conservatively, but Bradley, in the 6 years since taking over the company, had leveraged the business considerably to fund a series of acquisitions and renovations that had not yet generated the returns he projected. The 3 new showroom locations Bradley was planning to announce at that party required him to secure both a substantial new credit facility and the consent of his existing lenders and landlords to modify terms on his current locations, because Sorensen Home Furnishings was, at that moment, closer to the edge of its covenant limits than Bradley had disclosed to almost anyone, including, I would eventually learn, his own wife. I did not know all of these specific details when I sat in my car in my parents' driveway 18 months earlier. But I had known for years, generally, that the underlying real estate beneath 3 of Bradley's key showroom locations was undervalued, and I had purchased it methodically and quietly, because it was simply a good investment. What I had not fully appreciated until I began doing deeper diligence in the months after that birthday dinner was just how central those 3 specific leases were to Bradley's entire expansion plan, and just how much leverage the original lease structures, drafted by his father decades earlier, gave to whoever held them. By the time I walked into Kendall and Bradley's celebration party, I held, through my holding company, the ground leases beneath the 3 showroom locations that Bradley needed to use as collateral for his expansion financing. I held a meaningful minority position in the regional bank that his existing credit facility ran through, and I held, through the same distressed debt purchase that had brought me my parents' mortgage, direct knowledge of exactly how thin the margin was between Bradley's public confidence and his private financial reality. None of this, I want to be clear, had anything to do with revenge when I first acquired it. I acquired these positions because they made sound financial sense, years before that birthday dinner ever happened. But sitting in my parents' driveway that night, and then over the following 18 months of building my fictional collapse, I came to understand that I was not actually walking into that celebration party as a woman who had lost everything. I was walking in as a woman who, quietly, without anyone in that family understanding it, already held significant structural power over the very expansion they were about to celebrate. The party was held at Kendall and Bradley's house, a large colonial-style home in the most expensive part of town, the kind of house with a circular driveway and a catering staff that outnumbered the immediate family. I arrived wearing the same plain gray sweater I had worn to the anniversary dinner, layered under a coat I had bought at a discount outlet specifically for the occasion, because I wanted every visual detail of my presence to read as exactly what my family had decided I now was. The party was, by any measure, a spectacle. String lights wrapped the backyard trees. A jazz trio played near the pool. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. I counted, at a rough estimate, close to 150 guests, including business associates, extended family, and what appeared to be several members of the local Chamber of Commerce, the kind of crowd assembled specifically to witness and validate an announcement. I found my mother near the bar, deep in conversation with my Aunt Patricia. When she saw me, she gave me a quick, distracted hug and said, "Oh, Vanessa, you made it. There's a coat check inside if you want to leave that." I kept my coat on. At exactly 8 o'clock, Bradley climbed onto a small platform that had been set up near the pool, tapped a microphone, and began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked his late father for building the foundation of the company. He thanked Kendall, calling her the heart of the Sorensen family and the reason he had the confidence to take the business to its next level. And then he announced the expansion. 3 new showroom locations. A $22 million capital raise, partially financed through new investors, partially through an expanded credit facility with his existing bank. Projected revenue growth of 60% over the following 3 years. The crowd applauded warmly. Someone popped a bottle of champagne with theatrical flair. And then, in a moment I genuinely believe Bradley intended as a kindness rather than cruelty, though the effect landed very differently, he gestured toward the crowd and said, "I also want to take a second to acknowledge that not everyone in this family has had as smooth a year. My sister-in-law Vanessa has had a really tough stretch recently, and I just want to say in front of everyone, that family sticks together no matter what. Vanessa, we love you, and I hope some of tonight's excitement can be a bright spot for you too." The crowd turned to look at me, applauding gently, the particular applause reserved for a person being publicly acknowledged as the sympathetic case at someone else's triumph. I smiled, because I had spent 11 months training myself to smile exactly like that, tired and grateful and slightly overwhelmed. My mother, standing near me, actually reached over and squeezed my arm, the most physical affection she had shown me in months, purely because in that moment, in front of 150 guests, I had become useful to the story she wanted to tell about her family's compassion. After the applause faded, several of the guests I did not know well drifted toward me with the particular gentle, condescending warmth people reserve for the family member who has visibly fallen on hard times. A woman I recognized vaguely as one of Bradley's business associates took my hand and told me, in a tone that managed to be both sympathetic and faintly self-congratulatory, that she thought it was so brave of me to show up tonight at all, given everything I must be going through. Another guest, an older man I gathered was a member of the local Chamber of Commerce, asked me what field I had been in before things fell apart, the phrasing itself carrying an assumption that whatever I had built no longer counted as anything, that it had already been filed away in the past tense. I answered every question with the same tired, gracious half-smile, watching, with something close to fascination, how quickly and completely a room full of successful, sophisticated people could reorganize their entire understanding of a person around a single unverified story. My Uncle Frank, my father's older brother, found me near the dessert table and, in a moment I have thought about many times since, offered me $200, folded discreetly into my palm like something illicit, telling me quietly that he did not want me to feel embarrassed asking, but that he knew things were hard and he wanted to help however he could. I did not take the money, though I understood, watching his face, that the gesture came from a genuine place, a small, uncomplicated kindness offered without any performance attached to it. It was, I realized later, one of the only completely honest moments of the entire evening, and it came from the one relative in that family who had never once needed my failure to make sense of his own life. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, I found myself in the kitchen with Kendall while the catering staff cleared platters around us. Kendall had clearly had several glasses of champagne, and her guard was down in the particular way alcohol lowers guards, revealing things people would otherwise never say out loud. "Can I be honest with you?" Kendall said, leaning against the counter. "I know this is probably a hard night for you, watching all this. But I have to tell you, Vanessa, it feels really good. For once, I'm not standing in your shadow. For once, Mom is talking about my life instead of asking why I'm not more like you." She laughed, a little unsteadily. "I know that sounds awful, but you have no idea what it's like growing up compared to someone who always wins." I looked at my sister for a long moment. I thought about telling her, right there in that kitchen, exactly how wrong she was about who was actually winning. I thought about it, and then I decided against it because the story was not finished yet, and I had learned across 12 years of negotiation that the person who reveals their hand first is rarely the person who wins the table. I'm happy for you and Bradley, I said instead. Truly. I want to tell you now about the 11 weeks that followed, because this is where the actual structure of my plan came into motion, and where the distance between what my family believed and what was actually true finally began to collapse in on itself. The first thing that happened is that Bradley's expansion financing hit an unexpected snag. His existing bank, in reviewing the terms of the new credit facility, required updated appraisals and lease confirmations on the 3 showroom properties being used as partial collateral for the deal. This is, I want to be clear, a completely standard part of any commercial lending process. There was nothing unusual or suspicious about the request. What was unusual, though nobody at the bank or in Bradley's circle had any reason to know it, was that the underlying ground leases on all 3 properties were held by a holding company that I controlled, and that the terms of those leases, drafted decades earlier by Bradley's father in a very different commercial real estate environment, contained a series of covenants regarding consent, assignment, and modification that had simply never been triggered before, because no lessor had ever had a reason to enforce them with any rigor. I did not do anything dramatic. I did not sabotage the leases or invent violations. I simply, through my attorney, exercised the ordinary and completely legal rights available to any commercial ground lessor whose consent was being sought as part of a major financing transaction. I requested detailed financial disclosure from Sorensen Home Furnishings as a condition of consenting to the lease modifications the bank required for the deal to close. This is standard practice. Any sophisticated commercial landlord would have requested the same thing. The only difference, is that I already knew, through my earlier diligence, roughly what that disclosure would reveal, which is that Sorensen Home Furnishings was operating far closer to its covenant limits than Bradley had told his investors, his bank, or his wife. Before I tell you about my mother's phone call, I want to describe one more piece of the machinery that made all of this possible, because I think it matters. My attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Renata Cho, who has represented me for 9 years, was the only person outside my own head who knew the complete shape of what I was building. I told her everything from the very beginning, sitting in her office 3 weeks after that birthday dinner, and I remember her leaning back in her chair for a long moment before she finally said, "Vanessa, I will help you build this, because it is your right to structure your own affairs however you choose, and everything you're describing is legal. But I want you to understand something. Once you tell people this story, you cannot fully control what they do with it. You are not just testing your family. You are handing them a scenario, and people do unpredictable things inside scenarios, even people you think you know completely." I told her I understood, though I do not think I fully did, not yet. Renata drew up the actual paperwork for the fictional restructuring with the same rigor she would have applied to a real transaction, because she understood, better than almost anyone, that a lie only survives scrutiny if it is built with the same discipline as the truth. She helped me identify which of my actual holdings needed additional insulation, which corporate structures needed to be reinforced so that no amount of curious poking around by my family, or by anyone connected to my family, could accidentally stumble onto the real architecture underneath the fiction before I was ready to reveal it myself. My real assistant, a quietly brilliant young man named Desmond who has worked for me for 5 years and who I trust the way I trust almost no one else in my professional life, was the only other person who knew the full truth. Desmond was the one who fielded the occasional call from an extended family member fishing for information, who maintained the modest rented office I visited twice a week, who helped me construct, line by careful line, a narrative detailed enough to survive a family that, I suspected correctly, would never actually ask a single specific question but might, at any moment, decide to start. The second thing that happened is that my mother called me 3 weeks after the party, in a state of visible distress I had genuinely never heard from her before. "Vanessa," she said, her voice tight, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you know anything about a company called Meridian Holding Partners?" Meridian Holding Partners is the name of my holding company. I had built it specifically to be unconnected in any obvious way to my own name, and I felt, for just a moment, a small flicker of something like admiration that my mother had somehow found the name at all, before I understood immediately what must have happened. Someone at Bradley's bank or Bradley's attorney, doing routine diligence on the lease consent request, had traced the ownership structure back far enough to surface the Meridian name in a conversation, and that name had made its way, through the particular gossip channels that exist within families, back to my mother. "Why do you ask?" I said. "Bradley's attorney mentioned it," my mother said. "Apparently this Meridian company owns the land under 3 of his stores, and they're causing some kind of problem with his financing. He's very stressed about it. Kendall is beside herself. I just thought, since you're in finance, maybe you'd heard of them, or maybe you could look into it, see if there's anything you can do to help." I sat with that request for a long moment. The request from my own mother, asking the daughter she believed had lost everything to somehow use her supposedly non-existent resources and connections to help save her golden child's husband's business, a business whose real estate happened to be owned, though my mother had no idea, by the very daughter she was asking for help. "How is Kendall handling all this?" I asked, mostly to see what my mother would say. "She's a wreck," my mother said. "She keeps saying Bradley promised her everything was under control. I told her not to worry, that these things always work themselves out. I told her that's just how business is." She paused. "I didn't want to say this before, Vanessa, but I suppose I should tell you now since we're talking about it. When you told us about your own troubles, I don't think any of us fully understood how frightening it must have been. I think I said some things that weren't very sensitive. I hope you know I didn't mean them the way they sounded." I remember sitting very still when she said this, because it was, in its own limited and imperfect way, closer to an apology than my mother had offered me in perhaps a decade, and it was arriving now, unprompted, only because she needed something from me. I did not point this out to her yet. I simply told her again that I would see what I could find out, and I hung up the phone and sat at my desk for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over in my mind, trying to decide what it actually told me about her, beyond the obvious. "I'll see what I can find out," I said. The third thing that happened is that my father, for days after that phone call, showed up unannounced at the small rented office space I had set up specifically to maintain the fiction of my collapse, a modest room in a shared workspace building that I visited perhaps twice a week to keep up appearances. My father had never once, in 12 years, visited any office I had ever worked from. He found me there on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at a plain desk with nothing on it. And he looked around the room with an expression of genuine, unmistakable pity that I had never once seen directed at me before, an expression I realized, watching him, he had probably wanted to give me for years but had never had an occasion that fit the story. "I wanted to see how you're doing," he said, which was, I understood immediately, not really true. What he actually wanted, I learned over the following 20 minutes of stilted conversation, was to ask me, indirectly and awkwardly, whether I had any old contacts, any remaining relationships from before my collapse, who might be able to help Bradley navigate whatever problem this Meridian company was causing with his lease consent. My father, who had never once asked me a single detailed question about my actual business over 12 years of real success, was now, in the wreckage of my fictional failure, hoping I might still be useful enough to help save his son-in-law. I told him I would make some calls. Before he left that small rented office, my father lingered near the door for a moment, looking at the bare walls, the single window that faced a parking lot, the absence of anything that suggested the life he had always assumed I was building. "You know," he said, "your mother and I always thought you'd end up fine. You were always the practical one." He said this as though it were a comfort, as though the word practical had ever, in 36 years, been offered to me as praise rather than as a polite substitute for a compliment he could not quite bring himself to give. I did not correct him. I simply thanked him for stopping by, and I watched him walk to his car, and I understood, watching him go, that he had come to that office not to see how I was doing, but to assess whether I still had anything left in me worth asking for. I want to walk you through what happened over the following 6 weeks in more detail, because this is the part of the story where everything I had built quietly over the previous 18 months finally converged. Bradley's expansion, as it turned out, was more precarious than even I had initially estimated. The lease consent issue with the 3 Meridian-owned properties was, in itself, a solvable problem, a matter of paperwork and negotiation that any competent commercial attorney could have resolved within a few weeks under ordinary circumstances. But the delay it introduced had a cascading effect on Bradley's broader financing timeline. His new outside investors, a group of 3 private equity partners who had committed capital contingent on the deal closing by a specific date to align with their own fund's investment cycle, grew increasingly nervous as the lease issue dragged on. His bank, seeing the investor group's hesitation, grew more conservative in its own underwriting. And Bradley, under mounting pressure from all directions, began making decisions that revealed, with startling clarity, exactly how thin the margin of his business actually was. He drew down an emergency line of credit against his personal assets, including, I would later learn, a life insurance policy and a portion of Kendall's own inherited savings, without fully explaining to her the severity of what he was doing. He delayed payments to several of his existing suppliers to preserve cash for the closing costs on the new locations, a decision that began generating exactly the kind of vendor complaints that show up in credit reports and due diligence files. And in a decision that I believe, even now, was born more of panic than of any deliberate intent to deceive. He provided his bank with a set of updated financial projections for the new showroom locations that were, to put it generously, considerably more optimistic than the underlying market data supported. None of this was invisible to me, because as the holder of the ground leases beneath 3 of his properties and as a minority stakeholder in the bank underwriting his credit facility, I had, entirely through legitimate and legal channels, a clear window into exactly how the deal was unraveling in real time. I did not orchestrate the unraveling. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be a much simpler story if I had, and it would also not be true. I did not sabotage Bradley's business. I did not manipulate his projections or pressure his investors. What I did was far quieter and, in its own way, far more consequential. I simply declined to make the process easy. Where an ordinary landlord, eager to preserve a friendly relationship, might have expedited the lease consent process as a courtesy, I required my attorneys to proceed through every standard diligence step with complete rigor. Where an ordinary minority bank shareholder might have stayed entirely passive, I asked, through entirely appropriate channels available to any significant shareholder, pointed questions about the underwriting standards being applied to a credit facility this size, questions that any responsible shareholder concerned about the bank's risk exposure would have been well within their rights to ask. The effect of this quiet, entirely legal friction was that Bradley's $22 million expansion, which had been announced with champagne and string lights and a jazz trio in his own backyard, began to visibly, publicly, unravel over the following 2 months, in exactly the kind of slow, humiliating, cascading way that these things tend to unravel once the underlying weakness in a business is finally exposed to sustained scrutiny. During those same 6 weeks, I had a conversation that, in some ways, taught me as much about myself as the eventual family dinner would. An old colleague of mine, a commercial real estate broker named Priya Nair, who I had worked with on several deals over the years and who had no idea about the fictional collapse I had constructed, called me one afternoon to ask, casually, whether I had heard anything about the trouble at Sorensen Home Furnishings, since she knew, through entirely separate channels, that I had once looked at some of their underlying real estate years earlier. I told her I had heard a little. Priya, who had never once shown any particular warmth toward my family and had no reason to perform anything for my benefit, said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. She said that in her experience, businesses rarely collapse because of a single bad decision. They collapse because the people running them build an entire structure on top of a foundation nobody has stress-tested in years, and then act surprised when the first real pressure finds every hidden crack at once. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, because I understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that she was not only describing Bradley's business. She was describing my family, and in some ways, she was describing the version of myself who had spent 36 years quietly absorbing pressure without ever telling anyone how much of it I was actually carrying. The vendor complaints Bradley had generated by delaying payments during those 6 weeks began showing up in places that made the crisis increasingly difficult to contain quietly. A regional trade publication that covered the furniture and home goods industry ran a short item noting that Sorensen Home Furnishings appeared to be experiencing cash flow difficulties, citing 2 unnamed suppliers who said they had experienced payment delays of 60 days or more. My mother, who read that publication because one of her book club friends had a husband who subscribed to it, called me in a panic the same week it ran, asking whether I had seen it, asking whether this meant things were even worse than we knew. I remember the specific irony of that moment, my mother calling me, The daughter she believed had lost everything, to ask whether I could help her understand a crisis that I had, through entirely legal and unremarkable means, played a quiet structural role in accelerating. I told her I had seen the article. I did not tell her anything else. The fourth thing that happened is the dinner where it all came apart. My mother called an emergency family dinner on a Thursday evening in late May, the kind of dinner that gets called not to celebrate anything but to manage a crisis collectively, the way families sometimes do when they cannot quite bring themselves to say out loud what is actually happening. I arrived to find Kendall already there, her eyes red, Bradley sitting beside her with the particular gray hollowed-out look of a man who has spent several consecutive nights not sleeping. My father sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him that I recognized, from the particular formatting, as printouts of financial disclosures related to Sorensen Home Furnishings, the kind of documents that get generated during exactly the sort of credit review Bradley's expansion had triggered. "We need to talk about what's happening with the business," my mother said, once we were all seated, her voice carrying the particular strained calm of someone trying very hard to manage a situation she does not fully understand. "Bradley, can you explain to Vanessa what's going on? Maybe she has some ideas, given her background." Bradley explained, haltingly, that the expansion financing had fallen apart, that his 3 outside investors had withdrawn their commitment after the delay caused by the lease consent issue pushed past their funds deadline, that his bank, in the wake of the investor withdrawal, had conducted a fresh review of his existing credit facility and discovered, in the course of that review, that his current showroom locations were carrying significantly more debt relative to their revenue than the bank's original underwriting had reflected, in part because of the emergency lines of credit he had drawn against his personal assets without fully disclosing them, and in part because of the vendor payment delays that had begun, generating negative marks against the business. The bank, Bradley explained, his voice cracking slightly, had issued a formal notice that they were reviewing his existing credit facility for covenant violations, a review that could, in the worst case, result in the bank calling the loan entirely, a scenario that would force Sorensen Home Furnishings, the business Bradley's father had spent 30 years building, into an immediate and catastrophic liquidity crisis. "How bad is it?" my father asked, in the same flat, calculating tone he had used with me at that first dinner, the tone of a man assessing damage rather than offering comfort. "Bad," Bradley said. "If the bank calls the loan, we lose the company. All of it. Every location my dad built." My mother turned to me. "I want you to understand the exact moment this happened, because it is the moment I had been waiting 18 months for, without fully knowing, until it actually arrived, how it would feel. Vanessa," my mother said, "you know about finance. Is there anything you can do? Anyone you can call? I know things have been hard for you, but this is Kendall's whole life. Please." I looked around the table at my family. At my father, who had spent 12 years never once asking me a single question about my real career, now looking at me with something close to desperation because he needed my expertise. At my mother, who had spent 36 years measuring my worth against my sister's, now begging me for help because the daughter she had always favored was finally facing the exact kind of collapse she had once, quietly and gleefully, assumed I was facing. At Kendall, crying into a napkin, the same sister who had told me in her own kitchen that my supposed downfall made her feel good for once, now needing the very downfall she had celebrated to somehow be reversed by the sister who had experienced it. I let the silence sit for a long moment, the same kind of silence I had used at that first dinner 18 months earlier, and then I said, "I actually do know something about this situation." "You do?" my mother said, leaning forward. "I know quite a lot about it, actually," I said. "Because I own the ground leases underneath 3 of Bradley's showroom locations through a company called Meridian Holding Partners. And I hold a meaningful position in the bank that's currently reviewing his credit facility. And I have known for several months now, in fairly precise detail, exactly how thin the margin was on this expansion." The table went completely silent, the particular silence that I have come to understand only happens in rooms where a fundamental assumption has just been proven false in real time. "I don't understand," my mother said slowly. "You lost everything. You told us you lost everything." "I didn't lose anything," I said. "I told you I did." I watched, over the following several minutes, as my family's faces moved through a sequence of expressions I have thought about many times since. Confusion first, the simple cognitive difficulty of reconciling 2 contradictory facts. Then, on my father's face specifically, something that looked almost like calculation, the beginning of an attempt to figure out what this new information meant for him, before I had even finished explaining anything. Then, on my mother's face, something closer to genuine shock, the particular shock of a person realizing that a story she had built her understanding of her own family around had been, from the very beginning, entirely false. "Why," Kendall said, her voice small, "why would you lie about something like that?" "Because I wanted to know something," I said. "I wanted to know what this family actually does when it believes I have nothing left to offer. Not what you say you would do. What you would actually do." I looked around the table slowly. "And now I know. Mom, you told me that maybe now I'd understand why you always encouraged me to find something more stable. Dad, your first question was how much I'd lost, not whether I was okay. Kendall, you told me in your own kitchen that watching me fail made you feel better about your whole life." I turned to look directly at my sister. And now, 11 weeks later, the very sister who told me my collapse made her feel good is asking me to save her from a real one. My father was the first to break the silence after that, and what he said told me almost as much as the original dinner had. "So you're telling us," he said slowly, "that you've had money this whole time. That you let your mother worry. That you let Kendall go through her wedding anniversary thinking her sister was struggling." His tone was not soft. It was not even particularly curious. It carried the specific note of a man building a case, the same tone I imagine he uses when negotiating a contract, and I understood, watching him, that even now, confronted with the truth, his first instinct was not to examine his own conduct, but to identify a new angle from which I could be cast as the wrongdoer. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." "That's manipulative, Vanessa," my mother said, her voice rising for the first time that evening. "Do you understand how manipulative that is? You lied to your own family." "I did," I agreed. And in the 11 weeks since I told that lie, I have watched every single person at this table reveal, without any performance, exactly how they actually feel about me when they believe I have nothing left to offer. "Mom, you told me my failure finally made sense of my life choices." "Dad, you asked how much I'd lost before you asked how I was doing." Kendall told me in her own kitchen that my collapse made her feel better about her whole existence. I didn't manipulate anyone into saying those things. I simply gave you room, and you filled it with the truth. My mother opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Kendall was crying harder now, and I watched her rifle back through the previous 11 weeks in real time, watched her face shift as she began replaying every conversation, every small unkindness, every moment of relief she had allowed herself to feel at what she believed was my expense. "I need you to understand something," I continued, my voice steady. "I am not angry that bad things happened to me. Bad things happen to everyone. What I needed to know, and what I now know with total certainty, is what this family actually does with someone else's bad things. And the answer, I'm sorry to say, is that you use them. You use them to feel better about your own choices, to feel superior, to feel for once, like this story finally makes sense. That is not love. That is accounting." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Bradley, to his credit, was the first to speak. "Vanessa," he said carefully, "I understand you're angry, and honestly, I think you have every right to be, based on what it sounds like has happened in this family for a long time. But I need to ask you directly, are you willing to help us? Because if the bank calls this loan, it's not just Kendall and me who lose everything. We have 41 employees across our locations. Some of them have worked for my father's company for over 20 years. I want to be honest with you about what happened in the moment Bradley asked that question, because it is the moment where this story stops being a simple, satisfying tale of revenge and becomes something more complicated, which is, I have come to believe, closer to how these things actually resolve in real life. I had spent 18 months building an elaborate structure specifically designed to reveal my family's character, and it had worked exactly as I intended. I had watched my mother's relief at my supposed failure. I had watched my father's flat, transactional concern. I had watched my sister's barely contained delight. I had gathered, with total clarity, the information I had set out to gather. And I had also, in the process, acquired genuine structural leverage over my sister's marriage, her husband's business, and by extension, 41 employees who had done absolutely nothing to earn a place in my family's dysfunction. I did not answer Bradley's question immediately. Instead, I asked one of my own. Bradley, I said, when you delayed those vendor payments and when you drew down that emergency line of credit against Kendall's savings, did you tell her exactly how serious the situation was, or did you let her believe things were fine? Bradley did not answer right away, which was, in itself, an answer. I didn't want to worry her, he finally said. I turned to Kendall. Did you know before tonight exactly how much debt your husband had taken on, or exactly how much of your own savings he had put at risk? Kendall shook her head slowly, and I watched something shift in her expression. The particular shift of a person realizing that the marriage she has built her adult identity around contains rooms she has never been allowed to enter. I want to be very clear about something, I said, addressing the whole table now. I am not going to pretend that I built the position I have out of some grand strategic plan to rescue this family from a crisis. I built it because it made financial sense, years before any of this happened. And I chose to tell you I had lost everything because I wanted to see, without any performance or pretense on your part, exactly how this family treats weakness. I have my answer. It is not a flattering answer for any of you. I paused and let that settle. But I also think, I continued, that punishing 41 employees for my family's failure to treat each other with basic decency would make me exactly the kind of person my mother has always quietly believed I might become. Someone who chooses cruelty because it is available to her, rather than because it is right. I looked at Bradley. So here is what I am willing to do, and I want everyone at this table to understand that this is not charity, and it is not forgiveness. It is a business transaction with conditions. I laid out the terms over the following 20 minutes, terms I had, in fact, already prepared, because some part of me had suspected, even before I sat down at that dinner, that this was where the story might eventually lead. I would restructure the ground leases on the 3 showroom properties in a way that gave Bradley's bank the assurance it needed to reinstate the credit facility, but I would require, as a condition, full financial transparency going forward, quarterly reporting directly to me as a landlord with a legitimate interest in the ongoing viability of my tenant, and a restructured board position. A genuine advisory seat with real oversight authority over major financial decisions, not a ceremonial title. I would also personally guarantee a portion of the reinstated credit facility using my actual capital, the capital my family had spent 11 weeks believing did not exist, but only on the condition that Bradley agreed to a comprehensive third-party financial review of the entire business, conducted by an independent firm of my choosing, with the full findings shared transparently with Kendall. I am not doing this for you, Dad, I said, looking at my father. And I am not doing this because Mom asked me to. I am doing this because 41 people who have never done anything to me do not deserve to lose their jobs because this family cannot be honest with each other. But I want every single person at this table to understand something clearly. I know exactly what all of you actually think of me now. I do not need you to apologize for it tonight, because I do not think any of you fully understand yet what you revealed. But I am not going back to pretending I did not see it. The bank, ultimately, reinstated Bradley's credit facility 6 weeks later, on the terms I had structured. The independent financial review I required turned out to be, for Bradley and Kendall's marriage, considerably more consequential than the business crisis that triggered it, because it revealed, in careful and unambiguous detail, not just the extent of the debt Bradley had taken on without fully informing his wife, but a pattern of decisions stretching back nearly 3 years in which Bradley had consistently prioritized the appearance of the business's success over honest communication with the person who had built her entire financial future around trusting him. Kendall and Bradley are still married as of the time I am recording this, but the marriage that exists now is different from the one that existed before that dinner, more honest, in some ways harder, in the way that honesty often is. My relationship with my parents changed more slowly and more incompletely than I would have liked. My mother, in the weeks after that dinner, made several attempts at what I can only describe as partial apologies, statements that acknowledged she had reacted badly without ever quite acknowledging the pattern underneath the reaction. My father, true to form, focused almost entirely on the practical outcome, telling me repeatedly how relieved he was that the business had been saved, without ever engaging with the deeper question of why his first instinct, upon learning I had supposedly lost everything, had been to ask how much rather than "Are you okay?" I did not go back to pretending everything was fine, because I have learned, through this entire process, That pretending is exactly the mechanism that allowed my family's dysfunction to persist undisturbed for 36 years. I still see my parents. I still go to family dinners. But I go now with a clarity I did not have before, an understanding of exactly what my presence means to them, and exactly what it does not. 8 months after that dinner, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew me, including in some ways myself. I used a portion of the capital I had spent 18 months protecting behind my fictional collapse to establish a mentorship fund for young women entering finance from backgrounds without the kind of built-in family safety net that Kendall had always taken for granted. I named it deliberately after Harold Ackerman, the mentor who had once told me that the market does not care about your family story, only whether you are right about the numbers. The fund provides seed capital, structured mentorship, and perhaps most importantly, the kind of unconditional professional attention I had spent most of my 20s searching for and rarely finding. We funded our first cohort of 6 women that autumn. Women who reminded me, in different ways, of myself at 29, sitting at a folding table in a studio apartment, waiting for someone to finally evaluate her on the actual quality of her work. The first woman we funded, a 26-year-old named Adiz who had been working 2 jobs while studying for her CFA exams at night, cried when I explained the terms of her seed capital to her, not because the amount was enormous, but because, as she told me afterward, it was the first time in her professional life that anyone had extended her real resources without also extending an assumption that she needed to be rescued, managed, or explained. I understood exactly what she meant. I remembered, with total clarity, sitting across from Harold Ackerman at 25, waiting for him to tell me that the work I had done on a valuation model was good, actually good, not good for someone starting out, not good considering my background, just good, full stop. That kind of evaluation, uncomplicated by narrative, had changed the entire trajectory of my professional confidence, and I wanted to build a structure that could offer the same thing to other women who might otherwise spend years, as I did, mistaking the absence of unconditional support for a personal failing rather than what it actually was, which was simply the shape of the family or the system they happened to be born into. I invited my family to the small launch event we held for the fund, more out of habit than genuine expectation. My father came, stood near the back of the room during my remarks, and afterward told me, with what I believe was real if somewhat clumsy sincerity, that he was proud of what I had built. It was, as far as I can recall, the first time in my adult life he had said those specific words to me without qualification, without immediately pivoting to a question about Kendall or a comment about my personal life. I do not know whether that moment represents a genuine, lasting shift in how my father sees me, or simply a single instance of good behavior in an otherwise unchanged pattern. I have learned over the past year not to need the answer to that question as urgently as I once did. My mother did not come to the launch event. She told me over the phone the week before that she was still processing everything that had happened, that she needed time, and I told her, honestly, that I understood and that I was in no hurry. We speak now perhaps twice a month, careful, shorter conversations than we used to have, conversations that lack the easy warmth I sometimes still find myself missing, even now, even knowing everything I know. I have made a kind of peace with the fact that my mother may never fully reckon with the pattern she built our family around. Some people, I have come to believe, are constitutionally unable to look directly at the architecture of their own choices, and forcing them to look does not always produce the reckoning you hope for. Sometimes it simply produces distance, and you are left deciding how much of that distance you can live with. Kendall and I talk more now than we did before, in some ways more honestly than we ever have. The independent financial review of Sorensen Home Furnishings, once it was complete, became something of a turning point for her, not just in her marriage but in how she understood her own place inside our family story. She called me 4 months after that dinner, late on a Tuesday night, and told me that she had spent most of her adult life assuming that being the favored child meant she had somehow won something, and that it had taken watching me deliberately, methodically dismantle that assumption to understand that she had actually been given something much smaller and much more fragile than what I had built for myself without anyone's help. I do not think Kendall and I will ever be the kind of sisters who talk every day, who share every detail of our lives without reservation. But I believe, for the first time since that Easter egg hunt almost 30 years ago, that we are finally seeing each other clearly, without the story our mother built standing between us. As for Bradley, the business survived, restructured, more conservatively financed, and considerably more transparent than it had been before. He still runs Sorensen Home Furnishings, though the expansion plan that had once included 3 new showroom locations was scaled back to a single, carefully underwritten addition, funded on terms that reflected the business's actual capacity rather than the optimistic projections that had nearly destroyed it. I sit on that advisory board seat I negotiated, and I attend the quarterly meetings, and I ask every single time the kind of specific, detailed questions that nobody in my family ever once thought to ask me across 12 years of real, unglamorous, unrecognized success. I think often about that night in my car in my parents' driveway, the night everything in this story actually began. I think often about that night in my car in my parents' driveway, the night everything in this story actually began. I think about the cold, clear feeling that settled into my chest, the feeling of a lock finally clicking into place. I did not build my fictional collapse because I wanted revenge in any simple sense. I built it because I needed to know, with total certainty, what was actually true about the people I had spent my entire life trying to earn approval from. And once I knew, I found that I no longer had any interest in earning that approval at all. I had, instead, something far more valuable. I had clarity. And clarity, I have come to believe, is worth considerably more than the applause of people who only love you when your story fits the shape they have already decided it should take. People sometimes ask me, when I tell an abbreviated version of this story to close friends, whether I regret the 18 months I spent building an elaborate structure around a lie, whether there was a simpler, more direct way to have the conversation I needed to have with my family. I have thought about this question honestly more than once, and I do not think there was. I had spent 36 years asking my family, directly and indirectly, to see me clearly, and 36 years watching them decline the invitation, gently, politely, in 1,000 small ways that never quite rose to the level of a conflict I could name and confront. Direct conversations require both people to be willing to sit inside real discomfort together. My family had shown me repeatedly that they were only willing to engage with me on the terms of a story that made them comfortable. So I built a different kind of conversation, one where their comfort was no longer available to them, and I let their actions, rather than their words, tell me the truth. I do not recommend this approach lightly, and I do not think it is the right approach for every family or every situation. But for mine, it was the only method I had never tried, and it was, in the end, the only method that actually worked. I also think honestly about the version of this story where I chose differently at that final dinner table, where I let the business collapse, where I let 41 employees lose their jobs as a form of pure, uncomplicated punishment for a lifetime of being underestimated. I understand the appeal of that version. There were moments, particularly in the days immediately following that first birthday dinner, when I wanted exactly that kind of clean, total devastation. But I have come to believe that the difference between justice and cruelty is precision. The discipline to direct consequences only at the people who actually earn them, rather than letting collateral damage spread outward simply because it is available to you. My family needed to see themselves clearly. 41 employees who had never done anything except show up and work hard did not need to pay for that lesson. Holding both of those truths at the same time, the anger and the restraint, was the hardest part of this entire process, harder, in some ways, than building the fiction itself. If there is a lesson in what happened to my family, and to me, it is this: the people who truly love you will show you their love most clearly in the moment they believe you have nothing left to offer them. Everyone can celebrate your success. It costs nothing. But watch, very carefully, what people do when they believe your usefulness has ended, when they believe there is nothing left to gain from your presence. That moment, more than any birthday dinner or wedding toast or holiday gathering, will tell you the truth about who actually stands beside you and who was only ever standing beside your success. I built an elaborate trap to learn that lesson because I did not trust anyone in my family enough to simply ask them the truth and believe their answer. In the end, the trap taught me exactly what I needed to know, and it also taught me something I had not expected to learn. That real power is not the ability to punish the people who disappoint you. It is the ability to see them clearly, decide what you owe them and what you do not, and walk forward into your own life without needing their story about you to be true anymore. Take a moment today to notice, honestly, which people in your own life show up for you fully, and which people only show up for the version of you that makes them feel comfortable. The difference between those two kinds of people is often quieter and harder to see than you would expect, but once you see it clearly, you will never be able to unsee it again. I do not know what your own family looks like, or what particular story they have written around you that you may have spent years quietly trying to fit inside. But I want you to know that it is possible to step outside that story without burning your entire life down in the process, and it is possible to see people clearly without needing to punish them for what that clarity reveals. What you owe the people who raised you is not endless, unconditional performance of the role they have assigned you. What you owe yourself is the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when it costs you the easy warmth of pretending. I spent 18 months building a lie in order to finally arrive at that truth, and I do not regret a single day of it, because on the other side of it, I found something I had been quietly starving for since I was 8 years old, standing in front of a basket of Easter eggs. I found a family that finally saw me, exactly as I am, without a story standing in the way. It was not the family I had always hoped for, but it was, for the first time in my life, an honest one, and I have come to believe that honest is worth infinitely more than comfortable ever was.